I ironed the shirt twice that morning, though no one would notice but me. My hands trembled as I wrapped her gift, a small box carrying more memories than its weight should allow. Birthdays used to be laughter and frosting on her cheeks. Now, each candle she blew out seemed to push me further into the shadows. Still, I told myself today would be different. A father's hope is the hardest thing to kill. Before I go on, tell me, have you ever given everything to family, only to feel like a stranger in the home you built? The house smelled of balloons and perfume when I walked in, but the warmth wasn't meant for me. I could see it in the way eyes slid past me, in the empty chair no one offered. My daughter's smile didn't reach me. It cut me. And when her words finally came, sharp as glass, they carved me out of the celebration entirely. "Dad, maybe you should leave." The words still hung in the air when I stepped outside, though the laughter inside the house swallowed them quickly. I kept walking, but every footstep felt heavier than the one before. My daughter's voice replayed in my head, not as a slip of anger but as something deliberate, rehearsed even, that cut deeper than the command itself. When I reached the car, I sat with my hands on the steering wheel, staring at the wrapped box on the seat beside me. I had imagined her opening it with a smile, not leaving it untouched while I was escorted out of her life like an unwanted guest. It's strange how silence can be louder than shouting. The drive back was nothing but quiet roads and the hum of the engine, yet it pressed against me like judgment. I kept wondering, did anyone at that table stop her? Did anyone stand for me? I couldn't remember hearing another voice, just hers, sharp and final, as if she were cutting a cord between us. When I reached the house, I didn't turn on the lights. I walked through the familiar rooms by memory, sat down at the kitchen table, and left the gift in front of me. I unwrapped it slowly, as though the act itself could restore some dignity. Inside was a locket with a small picture, her as a little girl, frosting on her chin, looking at me like I was the whole world. I had kept that photo for years. My plan was to give it back to her so she'd remember the bond we once had. Now it mocked me. I poured myself a glass of water, though my throat was too tight to swallow. I thought about the years stacked behind me. Birthdays, graduations, the house I built, the long nights working shifts so she'd never have to feel less than anyone. I thought of the time she broke her arm falling from the swing, how I carried her through the rain, soaked to the skin but refusing to let her feel an ounce of fear. All those moments felt like a ledger, debts paid in love, but somehow the account had been closed by her without warning. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, every creak of the house reminding me of sacrifices etched into these walls. I had kept this roof steady when storms came, made sure the floors stayed strong, repaired every leak with my own hands. This house wasn't just timber and brick. It was a life's work. And yet, the one person I thought would always belong here made me feel like an intruder. By morning, the sting of humiliation turned into something else. A question I couldn't push away. If she could dismiss me so easily, had I built everything on sand? My chest felt heavy, but under it was a small ember of resolve. I wasn't ready to let her define me as disposable. I walked into the study where I kept the old filing cabinet. The metal was cool, stubborn from years of sticking drawers. Inside were the folders I had barely looked at in years, insurance, taxes, and at the very bottom, the property deed. I ran my fingers along the thick paper. The ink faded but clear. My name was there, steady as it had been the day I signed. Hers was there too. A later addition I once thought was a gesture of trust, a way to say, "This is as much yours as mine." Now, staring at it, I wondered if that trust had been misplaced. She had wanted me gone from her celebration. Did she think the same of this home? Did she believe I was already a ghost in these walls, someone who had outlived his usefulness? I folded the document back into the envelope and set it on the desk. My hand lingered, torn between memory and justice. Part of me whispered that a father forgives, that this was only a moment of cruelty born of pride. But another part, quieter yet sharper, said dignity matters too. A man without respect, even from his own blood, lives half a life. That day I didn't make any decisions. I let the papers sit there like a question I wasn't ready to answer. I went about the hours, fixing a squeaky hinge, sweeping the porch, small tasks to distract me. Yet everything I touched seemed to ask the same thing. If this house carries my labor, why should I let my name be treated as worthless within it? At dusk, I stepped outside. The air was cool, the street quiet. I looked at the house from the sidewalk, the way the porch light caught the edges of the roof, and felt a mixture of pride and sorrow. Pride because I had built it with my hands. Sorrow because the very person I thought I was building it for had turned her back on me. As I stood there, a memory came uninvited. Years ago, when she was just a child, she had once asked, "Daddy, will I always live here?" I laughed then, told her, "As long as you want, this will always be home." That promise had been real, spoken from the deepest part of me. But now I realize promises can only stand if both people honor them. I went back inside, closed the study door, and sat at the desk again. The envelope was still there, waiting. I didn't open it this time. I just looked at it and thought. Sometimes love asks for forgiveness, and sometimes it demands you remember your worth. That night, I fell asleep in the chair, the deed resting on the desk like a witness to all I had built and all I had lost. I woke with the cramp of a stiff back, the chair having held me all night. The envelope was still there on the desk, the edge of it bent slightly where my arm must have pressed against it in sleep. For a moment, I thought I'd dreamed the whole thing, that maybe the birthday, the dismissal, the humiliation, all of it had been some cruel trick of my mind. But the silence in the house told me it had been real. No sound of her voice, no trace of her laughter. Only the hollow truth. I stood, splashed water on my face, and tried to shake off the fog of restless hours. Yet I couldn't escape the image of her smile at the party. Not the warmth of a child's smile, but the thin, practiced one of someone performing for others. It was as if she wanted me erased in front of them, to prove a point that I no longer mattered. The thought gnawed at me. Why do that in front of an audience? If she had grievances, couldn't she have spoken to me privately? What was she trying to gain by cutting me down publicly? The questions circled, each one pulling me deeper into suspicion. Later that day, I decided to return to the scene, not to the party, but to the neighborhood. I drove past her house, slowly, careful not to be noticed. Balloons were still tied to the porch railing, drooping now in the daylight. Cars lined the street, leftovers from last night's celebration. The house looked alive with chatter, but I felt no part of it. As I sat in the car, I wondered what stories she was telling inside. Was she laughing about my departure? Was she spinning a tale that painted me as difficult, stubborn, or worse? I knew how quickly a narrative can shift in families. All it takes is one loud voice to drown out years of truth. I left before the bitterness could grow further. Driving back, I thought of the times she once leaned on me. When she was younger, she'd call me for advice about money, about friends, about choices she wasn't sure how to make. I never hesitated to answer, no matter how late the call. Yet now, she didn't even hesitate to push me out the door. That evening, I made myself a simple meal. Bread, cheese, a slice of apple. I sat at the same table where so many family dinners had taken place, the sound of laughter once filling the space. It was in that quiet moment that I realized. My home had become a museum of memories, but not of current life. The rooms echoed with ghosts of what used to be, while the present offered little more than emptiness. I couldn't avoid the thought that maybe I'd held on too tightly. Maybe by giving too much, I had taught her to expect without gratitude. Maybe by trying to shield her from every storm, I had made her careless about burning bridges. The next day, the phone rang. It was one of my brothers. He'd heard whispers already. "What happened last night?" he asked. His tone wasn't gentle, it was curious, as though he wanted the story for entertainment more than for comfort. I told him the truth plainly, that she asked me to leave her birthday. He chuckled nervously, said maybe it was nothing, maybe she was just stressed. But behind his words, I heard what he really thought, that it wasn't nothing. Family gossip spreads faster than wildfire. If one person knew today, 10 would know tomorrow. And with every retelling, the truth would bend, twisting until I became the stubborn father who couldn't let go. The man who didn't know his place anymore. That was the part that unsettled me most. I hung up the phone and sat in the silence again. For the first time, I wondered if this was her intention all along. Not just to send me out of a room, but to send me out of a narrative. To make me invisible in the story of her life, while still keeping the benefits of my sacrifices. Like my name on the deed. That thought didn't leave me. It followed me through the rest of the day, every task, every corner of the house. By nightfall, I knew I had to face it directly. If she wanted to erase me, I couldn't hand her the pen. The following morning, I found myself pacing the length of the kitchen, one hand clutching my coffee while the other traced the edges of the counter, as if the motion could keep me steady. I wasn't angry in the way I had been the night before. The sting had dulled into something else, an almost practical curiosity about where things were headed. If she had already tried to push me aside in public, then what would be her next move in private? I called her. My thumb hovered over her name for longer than I'd like to admit before pressing it. The phone rang 4 times before she answered, her voice carrying that light, hurried tone she used when she wanted to keep things surface level. I asked her if we could meet. She paused just long enough to let me know she didn't want to, then said she was busy but could spare a little time tomorrow. That tiny hesitation said more than her words. She wasn't afraid of me, but she didn't want a face-to-face conversation either. And when someone avoids eye contact, it's rarely because they're too busy. It's because they're hiding something. The next day, we sat across from each other in a cafe not far from her office. She picked the spot, likely because it was public, where voices couldn't rise and tempers couldn't flare. She stirred her coffee longer than necessary before speaking. "Dad," she started, "about the other night. Maybe I didn't handle it right, but you have to understand. I'm building my own life now." Her words hung in the air, polished and rehearsed. I studied her face, looking for the girl who once ran barefoot across the yard chasing fireflies. But all I saw was a woman determined to set boundaries that cut deeper than she realized. "I never wanted to be in your way," I said quietly. "But pushing me out in front of everyone, was that really necessary?" She didn't meet my eyes. "You wouldn't have listened if I'd said it privately." That line told me more than anything else. She had already decided her version of me, stubborn, unyielding, clinging to relevance, and nothing I said would change it. She had written her story, and I was no longer a supporting character in it. I let the silence stretch between us, not because I didn't have words, but because I knew the wrong ones would lock the door forever. Finally, I nodded. "If that's how you see it, then maybe you're right. But just remember, stories have consequences." Her brow furrowed at that, but she said nothing. On the drive home, I couldn't shake the weight of those consequences. I thought of the deed, the papers tucked away in the safe. She probably believed those details were forgotten, buried under years of family chatter. But they weren't. They were as alive as ever, waiting quietly like coals beneath ash. That night, I opened the safe. The papers were still there, crisp and certain. My name stood out in bold letters, undeniable proof of ownership. Holding them gave me a strange mix of reassurance and dread. It was power, yes, but also responsibility. How and when I used that power would define the course of what came next. I wasn't interested in revenge. That much I knew. But I couldn't ignore the fact that her dismissal had been calculated. It wasn't the slip of an overwhelmed daughter. It was a performance, crafted to diminish me in the eyes of others. That kind of move didn't come from a place of love. For the next few days, I lived in that tension, moving between normal tasks, groceries, fixing the fence, checking the mail, while my mind churned over what to do. The quiet moments became louder than the noisy ones, and in every silence, I heard her words. "I'm building my own life now." I wondered what her fiancé thought of it all. Did he encourage her? Did he laugh with her afterward about the old man being too proud to see his time was done? Or did he sit in silence, knowing that a line had been crossed but unwilling to risk calling it out? I considered calling him directly, but something told me that would only fuel the fire. Instead, I decided on patience. Time has a way of revealing intentions. If she was testing how far she could go, then I'd wait for the next step. And when it came, I would be ready, not with anger but with clarity. The truth is, I wasn't afraid of losing her. What unsettled me was the possibility that she had already chosen to lose me, and was simply arranging the stage to make it look like my fault. That kind of rewriting, once it takes hold, can be hard to undo. As the week ended, I sat on the porch one evening, watching the sun slide behind the trees. The papers were back in the safe, but the thought of them never really left my mind. I knew they were more than property documents now. They were a reminder that I wasn't powerless, no matter how much she wanted to make me invisible. I leaned back in the chair, the wood creaking beneath me, and whispered to no one in particular, "We'll see how the story ends." I spent the following week moving through my days in a rhythm that felt both familiar and foreign. The tasks were the same: mowing the lawn, sorting the mail, fixing the loose hinge on the gate. But my mind wasn't inside them. It drifted constantly, circling back to that cafe conversation, replaying her words and the way she avoided looking at me. Every time I tried to let it go, I'd remember the quick stir of her coffee, the way she rehearsed her lines, and I knew there was more beneath it. What unsettled me most wasn't her decision to draw boundaries. I could live with that. Children grow up, they build their own lives, and sometimes they pull away. No, what stayed with me was the public nature of it, the need to make sure others saw me diminished. That wasn't distance. That was rewriting who I was. On a quiet Thursday evening, I sat by the window with the deed in front of me. I wasn't looking at the words anymore. I knew them by heart. What I was really doing was weighing what it meant. Ownership was one thing. Control was another. Did I want to remind her of my authority, or did I want to remind her of my dignity? Those two roads looked similar, but they led to very different places. That night, the phone rang. It was her fiancé. His voice carried that nervous politeness men use when they aren't sure how to start. He said he wanted to talk man to man. I agreed. We met at a diner on the edge of town, the kind where the coffee never tastes fresh but the booths have seen more secrets than confessionals. He wasted little time. "Look," he said, "I know things got rough the other night." I told her she should have handled it better. "But she feels like you're holding on too tight." I studied him, this man who thought he could decode my relationship with my daughter in a handful of sentences. His words weren't cruel, but they were rehearsed, almost as if he'd been sent with a script. "Holding on too tight," I repeated. Funny. I thought raising a family was about holding on until they learned how to stand. I didn't realize standing meant pushing the hand away altogether. He shifted in his seat. "She doesn't mean it that way. She just wants space." I nodded slowly, letting the silence press on him. Then I leaned forward. "Tell me something. When she talks about me, does she talk about what I've done for her? Or only about what I've failed to do?" His eyes dropped to his coffee. That was answer enough. I left that diner knowing the divide wasn't shrinking. It was growing. And now there were two voices on the other side of it. Back home, I returned to the safe one more time. My hand rested on the documents, but I didn't pull them out. Not yet. Instead, I closed the door gently and sat down in my chair. For the first time, I asked myself not what I could prove, but what I wanted her to remember. Did I want her to remember a father who brandished papers and ownership like weapons, or a father who held his dignity so firmly that even betrayal couldn't strip it away? The choice wasn't easy. Pride whispered one answer, patience whispered another. And somewhere between those voices was the raw truth. If I didn't act, she might erase me from her story entirely. Days passed. She didn't call. Neither did he. The silence stretched, and in that silence, I realized something. Sometimes absence is louder than presence. Tells you exactly where you stand. One evening, as the light faded and the cicadas began their endless hum, I decided that waiting was no longer enough. If she wanted distance, I'd give it. But if she wanted to erase me, I'd remind her that dignity doesn't vanish just because someone looks away. So I began writing. Not a legal letter, not a confrontation, but a simple account of what I had built, what I had sacrificed, and what I refused to let slip quietly into someone else's narrative. It wasn't just for her. It was for me too, to set the record straight, To leave behind something that couldn't be twisted. As the pen scratched across the paper, I felt the weight lift. Not entirely, but enough to breathe easier. Enough to remember that my worth wasn't tied to her approval, nor to an audience's judgment. It was in the life I had lived, the battles I had fought, and the quiet resilience that kept me standing even when the people closest to me wanted me seated in the back. And though I didn't know how she'd respond when she eventually read it, I knew one thing with certainty. My voice would not be silenced. The letter I had written sat folded on my desk for days, untouched. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment to send it, but deep down, I knew I was hesitating because once it left my hands, there would be no pulling it back. Every word would be permanent, and so would her reaction. But then came the knock at the door. It was late, close to midnight. No one visits at that hour unless something is wrong. My chest tightened as I opened the door. Standing there was my neighbor, a man who had lived down the street for years. He looked uneasy. He asked me if I'd heard the shouting earlier, if everything was all right with my daughter. That question landed like a blow. I hadn't heard shouting. She hadn't called me. Yet, here was someone else asking about her, as if I was no longer the one meant to know. After he left, I sat back in my chair, restless. My mind wouldn't stop racing. Was she in trouble? Was it just a quarrel with her fiancé? Or was it something deeper? Something she didn't want me involved in? I couldn't shake it, so I picked up the phone. I dialed her number. It rang and rang until finally her voice came on the line. But it wasn't her, it was the recorded message. I didn't leave a word. What would I even say? That her father's neighbor had come knocking, concerned, while I was left outside the circle. Sleep didn't come that night. My mind looped between anger and worry. Anger because I was still her father, whether she admitted it or not. Worry because she was still my daughter, whether she liked it or not. That bond doesn't vanish. By morning, I decided to go into town. I wasn't going to confront her. Not yet. I just needed to see for myself with my own eyes that she was fine. Sometimes the truth is the only medicine for doubt. I parked a few streets away from her house. I didn't want her to think I was checking up on her like some uninvited inspector. I told myself I'd just sit for a while, watch, then leave. But what I saw twisted everything inside me. Her car was in the driveway. His was there too. But so was another, one I didn't recognize. And through the front window, I caught a glimpse of her laughing, surrounded by people. The kind of warmth she had once shared in our home. Only now it was happening without me. I can't explain the sting of that moment. It wasn't just exclusion, it was erasure. She was building a new version of her life, one where I was absent, almost as if I'd never been part of it to begin with. I drove back home with my hands tight on the wheel, my chest hollow. The silence in my house felt heavier than ever. That was when I unlocked the safe again. This time I didn't hesitate. I pulled out the deed, unfolded it, and laid it flat on the table. I read her name written there beside mine. I remembered the day I added it. It was supposed to be a gesture of trust, of future security. I wanted her to know she'd always have a place to come back to. But now, that same ink felt like a chain binding me to someone who no longer wanted me near. I thought of her birthday, of her words, of being told to leave in front of others. And then, I thought of this new gathering, the laughter I was no longer welcome to share. The pen sat in my hand. The sound of it scratching against the paper was almost louder than my own heartbeat. Her name vanished beneath a single, deliberate line. When I finished, I sat back, breathing hard. Not from exhaustion, but from something deeper. It was as if I had just severed a rope I'd been holding for too long, my hands raw from the grip. And yet, the silence that followed wasn't relief. It was suspense, heavy and unbroken. Because I knew the real storm hadn't arrived yet. She didn't know what I had done. Not yet, but soon she would. And when she did, she would finally understand that actions carry weight, and that I would no longer bear mine alone. I know what you might be thinking. Maybe I acted too quickly. Maybe I should have paused before crossing her name off the deed. Believe me, that thought has circled in my head more times than I can count. But tell me, how long can a man keep extending a hand before realizing it's only being slapped away? That's the thing about families. Outsiders often think arguments are just words, moments that pass. But when you've lived through years of cold shoulders, sharp remarks, and feeling like the guest in your own child's home, you start to notice the pattern. It isn't a single fight. It's a habit. And habits break people down. After I drew the line through her name, I felt different. Not free, not exactly. But there was a new clarity. For once, I wasn't sitting on the sidelines of my own life. I had taken back a measure of control. And yet, as I sat at that table staring at the papers, I couldn't ignore the ache in my chest. Because here's the truth. I didn't want to cut her out. I wanted her to choose me, to value me. And when she didn't, I chose myself instead. That weekend, I ran into an old friend at the grocery store. We had known each other since high school, but time had stretched the years between us. We stopped right there in the aisle, two older men catching up beside stacks of canned soup. He asked how my daughter was. I hesitated, the way a man hesitates when he doesn't want his private shame on display. I gave him a polite answer, something vague about her being busy with her own life. But I could see the question in his eyes, the unspoken wonder of why I was shopping alone, why there wasn't family by my side. People notice these things, even when they don't ask. That night, I thought about legacy. Not just money or property, but the story you leave behind. When people speak your name, what do they say? Did you matter to your family? Did they respect you? Or did they push you aside until you disappeared? I remembered my own father. We had our fights, sure, but I never once doubted his role. He was the pillar in the room whether I liked it or not. That's how it was in his time. Fathers carried weight, authority, responsibility, respect. Somewhere along the line, that balance shifted, and I found myself begging for space in the house I had provided. It made me wonder, when did fathers stop being seen as anchors and start being treated like relics? The following day, I received a call from the bank. Routine, they said. Just some verification on the property records. My chest tightened, knowing that soon the news would trickle down to her. She'd see the change. She'd realize her name was no longer there. I pictured her reaction. Shock first, then anger. Maybe she'd call me. Maybe she wouldn't. I spent hours pacing the living room, waiting for the phone to ring. Didn't. That silence was louder than anything she could have said. It told me she either hadn't noticed yet or she had, and chosen not to confront me. Both possibilities weighed heavily. Later that evening, I sat with the deed again. I wasn't gloating. I wasn't celebrating. I was reflecting on what it meant. Cutting her name wasn't revenge. It was a boundary. It was me saying, if you can throw me out of your life, I can remove you from mine. Still, I couldn't lie to myself. There was fear too. Fear of what would happen the day we finally spoke about it. Fear of burning the bridge completely, when part of me still hoped it could be rebuilt. But boundaries don't come without cost. I knew that, and as I closed the folder, slid it back into the safe, I whispered to myself, the next move isn't mine. You'd think silence could last forever, but it never does. It breaks, and when it breaks, it usually breaks loud. Mine came one ordinary afternoon, when my phone lit up with her name. The pause before I answered felt like a lifetime, like the universe had given me a moment to decide whether I was ready to face what was coming. Her voice wasn't calm. It wasn't even curious. It was sharp, already loaded with accusation. She had found out. The deed wasn't just paper to her anymore, it was evidence. Evidence that I had drawn a line she couldn't step over. She asked me how I could do it, as if I had committed a crime. Her words came fast, one after another, no room for me to catch up. I stayed quiet longer than I probably should have, because in that silence I was weighing my next move. Do I defend myself?
Do I explain?
Or do I let the weight of her anger crash down without resistance? When I finally spoke, my voice was steady. I told her it wasn't about punishment, it was about respect, about being seen, about being treated like more than a leftover piece of furniture. She didn't like that answer. She told me I had humiliated her, that I'd made her look foolish. And there it was, proof that it wasn't about the bond between us. It was about appearances, about how the world saw her, not how she saw me. That moment cut deeper than the paperwork ever could. Because I realized I had been hoping, deep down, that she'd finally understand. Instead, all I got was a mirror of the same indifference I'd been living with for years. She hung up on me, just like that. No resolution, no softening. Just silence again, but this time the kind that follows an explosion. I sat there staring at the wall, listening to the tick of the clock in the kitchen. Every sound in the house felt louder. The fridge hum, the creak of the floorboards, even my own breath. It was the sound of a house that didn't feel like a home anymore. I thought about calling her back, but my pride stopped me. Not the kind of pride people talk about with chest thumping and bravado. The quiet kind. The kind that whispers, "You've already said your truth. Don't beg to repeat it." The next few days were a blur. No word from her. No knock at the door. No sign of reconciliation. But the tension didn't stay hidden for long. One evening, her husband showed up. Not with politeness, not with an open mind. He came with accusation in his eyes before he even opened his mouth. He told me I'd crossed a line, that I'd embarrassed their family. His words felt rehearsed, like they had spent the last few nights building their case against me. I let him speak. I didn't interrupt. When he was done, I asked him one simple question. When I sat at that dinner table and she told me to sit in the back row at my own wife's funeral, where were you then? That stopped him. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. For once, he didn't have a defense. And in that silence, I realized something. It wasn't just me who had been treated as disposable. It was my role, my place as a father, that they had quietly erased. He left without shaking my hand. I closed the door behind him, leaned against it, and let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. My chest ached, but not from fear, from clarity. Families like to talk about unity, about blood being thicker than water. But when the test comes, you see what really holds people together. In my case, it wasn't love. It wasn't respect. It was convenience. And once I stopped being convenient, I was cast aside. That night, I took out the safe again. I looked at the papers, the names, the signatures, and I made another decision, this time even heavier. The deed wasn't the only thing I could change. I began rewriting my will. Not out of spite, out of balance, out of a need to leave behind something that told the truth about my life, not the version they wanted to paint. If she saw me as an obstacle, then I wouldn't burden her with my legacy. I would give it to the ones who had stood by me, even if they weren't blood. The neighbors who checked on me. The friend from high school who remembered to ask how I was doing. The people who made me feel like I still mattered. It wasn't about revenge. It was about recognition. As I set down my pen, I felt the weight of finality. Not the end of love. I still loved her, even if she couldn't return it, but the end of pretending. The end of waiting for her to be someone she had chosen not to be. And in that moment, I realized something else. Sometimes the deepest cut isn't what people take from you. It's what they refuse to give. People think the hardest part of betrayal is the moment it happens. The sting, the anger, the shock. But I've learned it isn't the moment itself. It's the days that follow, the quiet after the storm. That's where the real weight sits, where every choice feels like it could be your last statement to the world. When I rewrote my will, I thought I'd feel lighter, maybe even vindicated. Instead, I felt a strange mix of relief and grief. Relief that I had finally spoken for myself in a way that couldn't be erased. Grief because I knew I was closing a chapter with my own blood. A chapter that was supposed to last a lifetime. I found myself walking through the house more often, looking at every photo, every little mark on the wall. The dent in the doorframe where she used to bang her toy truck. The scratch on the kitchen counter from when she tried to help her mother cut vegetables. The house wasn't just bricks, it was a witness. It carried the memory of when she still saw me as her safe place. That's what made it harder. I wasn't rewriting a will in the abstract. I was rewriting her out of the story she helped create. And yet, what choice did I have? Love without respect becomes a cage, and I had lived in that cage long enough. I kept replaying the call in my head, her voice sharp, defensive. Not once did she pause to ask if I was hurting, if I had felt invisible, if her actions had left scars. It was all about how it looked to her. That told me everything. Some bridges don't burn because of a single flame, they rot slowly, until one day you realize the boards can't hold your weight anymore. Still, I asked myself, was I being too harsh? That question haunted me. I sat with it late at night, staring at the ceiling. I wanted to believe there was a version of the story where I held on and she came around. But every memory of the past few years whispered the same answer. No, I wasn't cutting her off. She had walked away long before the papers were signed. In those nights of reflection, I also realized something I hadn't admitted before. Part of me was afraid. Afraid of dying without reconciliation. Afraid she'd tell her children a version of me that wasn't true. Afraid the final image she held of me would be the man who fought her over property. But then I thought, hadn't I already given her enough chances to paint me differently? Hadn't I shown up, again and again, even when she told me to sit in the back row at my wife's funeral? Fear, I realized, is what had kept me quiet for years. Fear of rocking the boat. Fear of being alone. And yet, in my silence, I had already been alone. That truth was harder than anything. So, I leaned into something new, clarity. I decided to use the time I had left not chasing her approval, but investing in the people who saw me clearly. I invited the neighbor couple over for tea. I called the friend from high school and talked about the old days. I even began volunteering at the local food pantry on weekends, stacking cans and carrying boxes. It gave me something I hadn't felt in years, a sense that I still had purpose. Funny thing, when you stop waiting for one door to open, you notice all the others around you. Of course, that didn't mean the hurt vanished. It lingered. It always will. But instead of letting it chain me to bitterness, I tried to let it teach me. I told myself, family isn't just who shares your blood. It's who shows up when you're stumbling. One afternoon, as I was sorting papers at the dining table, I thought about my wife. She had been the bridge between me and our daughter, always softening the blows, always keeping us tied together even when we pulled apart. When she passed, that bridge disappeared, and I hadn't realized how fragile the foundation was. I whispered to her photo, asking if I was doing the right thing. I didn't hear an answer, of course, but I felt a strange steadiness settle over me, as if she was reminding me to trust myself. The days turned into weeks. My daughter still didn't call. Her silence told me she was waiting for me to break, to apologize, to undo what I had done. But this time I didn't bend. I didn't rush to fill the void. I sat with it. I let it be. And in that stillness, I began to accept something that once felt unbearable. Sometimes the story you thought you were living isn't the one you end with. Sometimes the people you thought would walk beside you choose another path. And sometimes the only way to honor yourself is to stop following them down a road where you don't belong. By the time I sealed the envelope with my final will inside, I felt a calm I hadn't known in years. It wasn't joy, not exactly. It was peace. The kind that comes when you finally stop fighting to be seen and start seeing yourself instead. If you were sitting here across the table from me, I think the first thing I'd ask is whether you've ever felt invisible in your own family. Not angry, not shouting, not even arguing, just invisible. That's the part people don't talk about. They talk about betrayal, about arguments, about the big fights. But the quiet kind of neglect, the kind where your voice doesn't count anymore, that cuts deeper than most knives. I guess that's what I've been living with. And now, after everything, I find myself wondering how much of it was my fault. Did I let it happen by being too quiet? Did I raise a daughter who thought silence meant weakness? Or did I just underestimate how much losing my wife would change the balance between us? These are the questions that don't leave you. They follow you from the breakfast table to the empty chair at night. The truth is, when I look back, I can see the warning signs clearer than ever. Small things. The way she'd roll her eyes when I offered advice. The way she'd cut me off mid-sentence when I tried to tell a story. Those moments felt harmless at the time, but they built up like bricks in a wall between us. By the time I realized how high it was, I couldn't see her anymore. There's a loneliness in that realization that I wouldn't wish on anyone. And I know some folks listening might think, Why not call her? Why not fight harder to mend it? Believe me, I've asked myself that every day. But how do you fight for someone who doesn't want to be in the ring with you? At some point, fighting looks more like begging. And I swore to myself I wouldn't beg for a place in my own family. That doesn't mean it doesn't ache. Some nights, I pour myself a drink and stare at the phone, my thumb hovering over her number. I imagine the conversation we'd have. Maybe she'd laugh it off. Maybe she'd soften. Or maybe she'd tell me once again that I'm the problem, that I'm holding her back, that I'm too old to understand her world. And if that's all she'd say, then maybe it's better the phone stays quiet. The silence, though, it has a way of teaching you things. I've started to realize that dignity isn't something other people give you. It's something you hold for yourself, even when others try to strip it away. For years, I thought being a good father meant being available no matter what, even if it cost me my pride. Now, I see that being a good man sometimes means standing tall, even if it means standing alone. I remember one night recently, I was fixing the hinge on the old shed door. My hands shook a little more than they used to, but I got it done. When I stepped back and looked at it, I laughed. Because in that moment, I realized I was proving something to myself. I wasn't finished. I wasn't helpless. I wasn't defined by the way she dismissed me. I was still here, still capable. And maybe that's what this chapter of my life is about. Not winning her back, but proving to myself that I never lost what made me whole. And that's the piece I want to share with anyone listening. We spend so much of our lives waiting for someone else to recognize our worth. A boss, a spouse, a child. But what happens when they don't? Do we collapse? Or do we decide that our worth doesn't come from their acknowledgement in the first place? Don't get me wrong. I still love my daughter. I still hope that one day she'll come knocking on my door. Not for money or favors, but just to sit down and talk like we used to. But if that day never comes, I want to know that I didn't waste my final years waiting by the window. I want to know that I lived them on my own terms, not defined by her silence. Some evenings, I walk through the neighborhood, and kids wave at me like I'm some kind of old storyteller. Maybe I am. Maybe that's the role I've been pushed into. And you know what? There's a strange comfort in that. If my own blood won't hear my stories, maybe someone else will. Maybe the lessons I've carried don't end with her. They can still mean something to others. That's the shift I've been making. From grief to purpose. From waiting for her to validating myself. It's not perfect. It's not clean. I still wake up some mornings with that heaviness in my chest. But more and more I wake up with clarity too. And clarity, I've learned, is worth more than comfort. I don't know how the end of my story will look. Maybe she'll surprise me. Maybe she won't. But what I do know is this. I'm no longer living like a man waiting for someone else's permission to matter. I've earned my place in this world, and I'll leave it with my head high. So, if you've ever felt invisible in your own family, I'll tell you what I've had to tell myself. Your worth doesn't shrink because someone else refuses to see it. Sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is step out of their shadow and stand in your own light. It's strange how life waits until you've convinced yourself things are steady before shaking the ground beneath your feet. I had been telling myself I was fine, that I had found a way to live without her approval, that I didn't need her to validate my place in the world. But one evening, as I was sorting through some old files in the study, a letter fell out from between the pages of an insurance folder. My hands froze the moment I saw the handwriting. It was hers. I sat there staring at the envelope for a long time. My heart wouldn't settle. It was postmarked from almost a year ago, which meant it had been hiding there all this time without my knowing. A dozen questions raced through my mind. Why hadn't she just handed it to me? What had changed that made her write instead of speak? And most of all, what did it say? I wanted to tear it open, but part of me hesitated. Sometimes words have more power unopened than they do revealed. I think I was afraid of what I'd find. Maybe she'd written something final, something that left no room for reconciliation. Or maybe it was the opposite, and by leaving it unread for so long, I had missed my chance to respond. When I finally slid my finger along the fold, the paper inside shook between my hands. The words weren't long. In fact, they were barely more than a page. But each line carried weight. She said she needed space, that she felt I was suffocating her decisions, even when I thought I was only advising. She said she loved me, but she couldn't handle the constant reminder of my disappointment. And then at the end, one short line. I hope one day we can meet again, not as adversaries, but as father and daughter. I read that line over and over until the letters blurred. The words didn't heal me, not right away, but they cracked something open inside. Because for the first time in years, I realized she hadn't thrown me away entirely. She was angry, yes, she was hurt, but there was still a thread tying us together, however fragile. That night, sleep wouldn't come. I paced the house, turning the letter over in my mind. Should I reach out? Should I respect the space she'd asked for? The suspense of not knowing what the right move was gnawed at me. It felt like being caught between two cliffs, and one wrong step would send me plummeting. The next morning, I brewed coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the phone. It would have been easy to dial, just a few taps, but something inside me said wait. Not because I didn't want to hear her voice, but because I wanted to be sure that when I did, I wouldn't come to her from a place of desperation. I needed to meet her as a man who had steadied himself, not as a father begging for scraps of connection. In the days that followed, I carried that letter with me like a secret compass. It didn't point me directly to her, but it reminded me there was still a direction worth walking in. I started noticing things I'd ignored before. Old photographs, keepsakes tucked in drawers, reminders of better days between us. Each memory carried its own weight, but instead of crushing me, they began to anchor me. Still, the question lingered. Was she ready to hear from me again? Or had that letter been a moment of vulnerability she no longer felt? That uncertainty sat in my chest like a stone. And sometimes it still does. What struck me most was the timing. She wrote that letter around the same period she'd kicked me out of her birthday celebration. The contradiction tore at me. How could she shove me away in one breath and then write such hopeful words in another? Unless, I realized, the truth was more complicated than either of us had admitted. Maybe she wasn't sure what she wanted either. Maybe the anger and love lived side by side in her heart, just as they did in mine. And maybe that's the part of family we never prepare for, that you can hold resentment and longing in the same hand, without ever knowing which one will slip through your fingers first. The letter didn't give me closure. It gave me something else entirely. A cliffhanger in my own life. Possibility I hadn't expected. And with that possibility came the most difficult task of all, patience. I tucked the letter back into its envelope and placed it in the drawer beside my bed. Not hidden away, not forgotten. Just close enough to remind me every morning that the story wasn't finished. And maybe, deep down, that's what I needed most. Not certainty, not even reconciliation. Just the knowledge that the door hadn't been slammed shut forever. That was enough to keep me standing, even in the silence. It's strange how even a small discovery can linger louder than years of silence. After finding her letter, I thought I'd feel driven to act immediately, but instead, I found myself stopping at every turn to examine my own part in this story. It was like holding a mirror I'd avoided for too long, and the reflection wasn't easy to accept. I kept thinking about the words she chose. Space, suffocating, disappointment. I wanted to argue with them, to explain myself the way I always had. But each time I tried, the explanations sounded like excuses. I realized how often I had spoken with the intent to correct, not to understand. And maybe that's what had pushed her to write instead of speak. The more I sat with that truth, the heavier it became. For years, I thought my role as her father gave me the right to guide, even to intervene. But maybe what she needed was something simpler. Someone to stand by her without trying to shape her path. The thought humbled me in ways I hadn't expected. On quiet mornings, I would sit with coffee in hand, rereading her line about meeting again as father and daughter, not adversaries. Those words stuck to me like a question I couldn't quite answer. What would it look like to stand in front of her without the old patterns, without that instinct to lecture or prove? Could I learn to simply listen? I found myself practicing in small ways. At the grocery store, when the cashier fumbled with change, I stopped myself from pointing it out. When a neighbor rambled about his troubles, I listened until he finished instead of rushing in with advice. It sounds trivial, But in those moments, I caught myself noticing just how quick I was to control the conversation. Maybe the hardest realization was that I wasn't just trying to guide her. I was trying to keep a piece of her tied to me. The more independent she became, the more I felt left behind, and I disguised that fear as concern. It was painful to admit, but once I did, something inside loosened. There were nights when the loneliness hit hard. I would picture her childhood, those evenings when she'd curl up beside me with a book, or the times she'd call me from school just to tell me something small. The contrast to where we stood now felt almost unbearable. But even in those memories, I noticed something I'd missed before. She had always been reaching for her own voice, her own ground. Maybe I just hadn't known how to let her take it without fear. The letter didn't solve our distance. It didn't erase the sting of her telling me to leave that day. But it forced me to look at myself differently. It made me see that reconciliation wasn't just about her forgiving me. It was also about me unlearning habits I had mistaken for love. I began writing, not with the plan of sending anything yet, but to train myself in a different way of speaking. I wrote letters I never mailed, each one stripped of advice and defense, focused instead on what I felt and what I hoped. Sometimes it was clumsy. Sometimes I still caught myself trying to justify. But slowly, I started to find words that came closer to honesty than control. What I didn't expect was how this process softened other parts of my life. Conversations with friends became less about my opinions and more about hearing theirs. Even simple exchanges with strangers carried a weight I hadn't noticed before. It was as if learning to let go with her was teaching me to live differently altogether. Still, the waiting was its own trial. Every day I wondered if she thought about me, if she regretted the letter, if she meant it when she wrote about meeting again. The silence was difficult, but it was also teaching me patience, something I hadn't been good at when it came to her. One evening, I took the letter out again and read it under the dim lamp by my bed. I traced the shape of her handwriting, the way certain letters tilted slightly to the right, the way she pressed harder on some words than others. It reminded me of her as a little girl, learning to write her name for the first time at the kitchen table. That memory almost broke me, but it also reminded me why I couldn't give up. If nothing else, that letter became proof that she hadn't closed the door completely. And as much as it hurt to wait, I knew rushing in might only push her farther away. So I made peace with the idea that healing would not happen on my timeline. It had to happen on hers too. Looking back now, I see that the letter wasn't just her reaching out, it was also a test. A test of whether I could hear her without trying to bend her back toward me. A test of whether I could love her enough to respect her distance. That realization didn't make the silence easier, but it gave it meaning. And for the first time in years, I could sit in that meaning without drowning in it. I thought I had settled into patience, but one evening, the quiet was broken in a way I wasn't prepared for. It was a Tuesday night, the kind of night where nothing was supposed to happen. I had just finished my dinner and was flipping through channels, half paying attention to the noise, when my phone buzzed on the table. The screen lit up with a name I hadn't seen in months, her fiancé. For a long moment, I just stared at it. My chest tightened in a way I couldn't control. We had exchanged words once before, and they weren't the kind of words that made a person eager to pick up again. I almost let it ring out, but something inside told me not to. I pressed accept and waited, saying nothing first. His voice carried a strain I didn't expect. "She doesn't know I'm calling you," he said quickly, like he had rehearsed it. "But I think you need to hear this." I didn't move. My hand gripped the phone tighter. Part of me wanted to hang up. Part of me wanted to demand why he thought he had the right to speak on her behalf. But his tone held something different from arrogance, it held urgency. He explained that she had been keeping the letter a secret from everyone, even him, until recently. When she finally admitted to writing it, she confessed that she wasn't sure I'd even care enough to read it. Hearing that cut deeper than I expected. It wasn't just distance she had felt. It was doubt in whether I even wanted her words. I sat frozen, listening as he went on. "She's scared," he said. "Not angry, not anymore. Just scared of what it would mean to try again and fail." Those words landed like stones in my stomach. Scared. That wasn't a word I had ever attached to her. I'd seen her as determined, sharp, even stubborn, but not scared. The image of her holding on to fear because of me left me speechless. Before I could respond, he added, "She doesn't know I'm saying this. And if you tell her, she'll never forgive me. But I think she needs you to try, just not in the way you used to." That last part lingered after the call ended. I put the phone down, but it felt heavier than before. His words echoed the lessons I'd been trying to learn through the letter. Less advice, less control, more listening. But hearing it from him, the man I had once dismissed as not good enough for her, made it all the more confronting. The conversation stirred something restless in me. If she was scared, then silence wasn't just space anymore. It was weight pressing down on her. I wondered if my waiting had been patience or avoidance. Maybe I had mistaken my stillness for progress when really it was fear of reaching out and being pushed away again. That night I couldn't sleep. I replayed her words in the letter, his words on the phone, and my own silence in between. I realized I had been telling myself I was respecting her space, but perhaps I had been hiding from the risk of rejection. By morning I had made a decision. I wouldn't call, not yet, because a sudden voice might feel like an intrusion. But I would write. Not the kind of letters I had been practicing for myself, but one meant for her eyes. Something short, honest, and without defense. Took me hours to shape the first sentence. Every time I started, I caught myself drifting toward explanations or old habits. I had to remind myself that this wasn't about convincing, it was about connection. Finally, I wrote, "I read your letter and I'm listening." The rest came slowly, piece by piece. I told her I was learning to hear without correcting, to sit with my discomfort without placing it on her shoulders. I admitted that I hadn't always known how to let her be herself without trying to mold her. I didn't ask for forgiveness. I didn't ask for anything at all. I simply told her that I was still here, and that I wanted to learn how to be the father she needed. When I sealed the envelope, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the address line for a long time. Was I overstepping? Was I rushing again? But then I thought about his voice on the phone, about the word scared, and I knew I couldn't keep hiding behind caution forever. Dropping that letter into the mailbox felt like stepping into unknown waters. My pulse raced as the metal lid clanged shut. There was no guarantee she would open it, no guarantee she would believe it, no guarantee she would respond at all. But it was a risk I couldn't avoid anymore. The days after felt longer than usual. Each time I walked past the window, I caught myself looking toward the mailbox as if an answer would come back that quickly. The silence grew louder, not quieter. But underneath it all, I carried a small thread of hope, that she might at least see the effort for what it was. And then, a week later, something shifted. I came home from running errands, and there it was, an envelope with her handwriting on the front. My knees almost gave out when I saw it resting there. For a moment, I couldn't even pick it up. I just stared at it, afraid of what was inside, afraid it might end everything before it had a chance to begin again. When I finally opened it, my hands shook. Inside was only a single page, written quickly, like she hadn't wanted to overthink it. The first line read, "I didn't expect to hear from you. I'm not ready for a big talk, but I'm willing to try, little by little." Those words lit something in me I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't reconciliation, not yet. But it was an opening. A doorway I thought had been closed for good. And for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to believe that we weren't finished. When I held that short note in my hands, I realized something I hadn't said out loud before. I had been waiting for a grand reconciliation, the kind you see in stories or hear about from other families. But instead, what I got was one line of cautious hope. And truthfully, that felt more real than anything I could have imagined. Her words, little by little, stuck to me like glue. They were both a warning and an invitation. She wasn't ready for anything dramatic, not a sit-down, not an apology dragged across hours. She was offering me a sliver, a test, a chance to prove I could handle her pace instead of forcing mine. I sat at the table with that page in front of me and thought about how to answer. For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to pour everything out. I didn't want to weigh her down with more than she had asked for. Instead, I told myself I would match her step for step. If she wanted little by little, then that's what I'd give. So I wrote again, but this time it wasn't long. Just 3 sentences. I told her I heard her, that I respected the way she wanted to move forward, and that I would be here when she was ready for the next step. I ended with the simplest line I could manage. Take your time. I'm not going anywhere. Dropping that letter in the mailbox felt different from the others. This time I didn't hover, wondering if it was too much. I didn't second-guess the words. I trusted that small was enough because that was all she had asked for. The waiting was quieter this time, though not easier. Every day I reminded myself that little by little could also mean long stretches of silence. I forced myself to keep busy, fixing things around the house I had ignored for too long. Still, every creak of the mailbox outside pulled my attention. After 2 weeks, another envelope came. This one wasn't just a note. It was 2 pages, folded neatly, as if she had sat with the words for a while. My hands trembled as I opened it, but the first line made me exhale. She had written, "I don't know how to start, but I guess this is me trying." She went on to describe moments from her childhood, things I hadn't thought she remembered. She wrote about how she used to hide in her room when I raised my voice, how she felt like I always had the right answer, and how that left no space for her mistakes. She admitted she didn't hate me, not even close. What she carried was exhaustion, from always feeling she had to measure up to a standard I never said out loud, but she felt all the same. Reading her honesty felt like standing in the rain with no umbrella. There was no defense to lean on, no easy reply that could undo the weight of what she had lived with. I let the words soak in, unprotected, and for the first time I didn't reach for an explanation. When I sat down to respond, I found myself writing slower than ever before. Each sentence I drafted, I asked myself, is this for her, or is this to make me feel better? If it was the latter, I crossed it out. What finally remained was plain. I told her I had heard her, that I hadn't realized how my certainty had turned into pressure for her, and that I was grateful she had trusted me enough to write it down. I didn't try to soften her memories. I didn't argue. I simply said, I see now what I couldn't see then. Weeks turned into a rhythm. She would send a page, sometimes short, sometimes long, and I would respond in kind. It wasn't constant. There were gaps where I'd hear nothing for a month, and I learned to sit with that without panic. Each envelope felt like a fragile thread being stretched across the distance, but it held. One of her letters stood out more than the rest. She mentioned her fiancé, how he encouraged her to keep writing even when she doubted if it was worth it. She confessed she was afraid I would never accept him fully, but she wanted me to know that he had been the one reminding her that family ties could still be repaired. That admission forced me to swallow a truth I had resisted for too long. He wasn't my rival. He wasn't a barrier. He was helping her find the courage to face me again. And maybe, in his own way, he was extending a hand toward me too. The old me would have bristled at the idea. But the man I was becoming, the one who had learned to sit with silence, to write without defending, to listen without correcting, saw it differently. Maybe the bridge I wanted to rebuild with her didn't just have to be between the two of us. Maybe it could stretch wide enough to hold him too. That thought lingered as I wrote my next response. I told her I respected the people who gave her strength. I didn't name him outright, but I knew she would understand. It was my way of opening a door without forcing her to walk through it. As the months passed, our letters became less about the past and more about small details of the present. She would tell me about her work, her walks, even the meals she cooked when she was tired but wanted comfort. I would tell her about fixing the garden, about books I had found, about memories I had of her as a child that still made me smile. It wasn't grand. It wasn't cinematic, but it was steady. And in that steadiness, I felt something I hadn't in years, connection without the weight of expectation. Looking back, I realize how close I came to missing this chance. If I had stayed in silence, convinced patience meant doing nothing, I might never have heard from her again. If I had rushed in with my old habits, demanding answers, she might have pulled away for good. But by matching her pace, I found a rhythm that was ours, not mine. And that's where we were, building something quiet, fragile, but undeniably alive. I had just gotten comfortable with the rhythm of letters when an envelope arrived that wasn't in her handwriting. For a moment I thought maybe it was nothing, maybe just another bill tucked in the wrong pile. But when I saw his name on the corner, her fiancé, I froze. We had never exchanged a single word directly. Our conversations had always traveled through her, carefully filtered. And now, suddenly, he was reaching for me himself. I sat at the table with the letter unopened for hours. Part of me wanted to shove it in a drawer, pretend I hadn't seen it. What if it was a warning? What if he was telling me to step back, to stop intruding in her life? My hands kept circling around the envelope, lifting it, putting it down, as if the weight of paper could already tell me what waited inside. Finally, as dusk pulled the light out of the kitchen, I tore it open. His words were plain, direct. He wrote that he wasn't sure if it was his place, but he wanted me to know that my daughter had been carrying both hope and fear in equal measure. Hope that this slow rebuild with me could last. Fear that one misstep would send us crashing back to silence. He asked me not to give up, not to read her hesitation as rejection. That single paragraph hit me harder than any confrontation. For years, I had painted him as a barrier, the man who had stolen her trust from me. But here he was, doing the opposite, trying to hold the bridge steady while we both learned how to cross it. I didn't write back immediately. Instead, I carried the letter around for days, folded and tucked into my pocket like a stone I couldn't put down. I thought about how strange it was that the person I had mistrusted most was now the one encouraging me to stay. It made me wonder how many stories I had written in my head that had never matched reality. When I finally did write back, I kept it simple. I thanked him. I told him I understood that trust wasn't just between me and her, that if he was part of her life, then he was part of this rebuilding too. I didn't pretend we were suddenly close, but I let him know I saw his effort, and I respected it. Weeks later, she wrote again. But this time there was something different in her tone. She said she had read my reply to him, and that it mattered to her more than I could guess. She admitted she had worried I would push him away, and that would force her to choose. "You didn't do that," she wrote. "You opened the door instead. That feels like the first real step forward." Reading that line, I realized how much fear had shaped not just her silence, but mine too. Fear of being rejected, fear of being replaced, fear of being forgotten. And yet, the one action that softened it all wasn't a grand gesture, but something small. An acknowledgement, an open door. But just when I felt the ground steady beneath me, something else shifted. A phone call came late one evening, and it wasn't her voice on the line. It was him again, his tone heavy, almost cautious. He said she had been struggling more than she let on in her letters, that she carried a knot of guilt she hadn't yet written down, and that she worried one confession might undo everything we had been building. I sat in silence as he spoke, my fingers gripping the phone tight. I wanted to demand answers, to know what she was hiding, but he didn't offer details. He only said, "She needs you to be patient a little longer. When she's ready, she'll tell you herself." After we hung up, I paced the house. Every sound seemed sharper, every shadow heavier. I thought about all the possible secrets, all the things she might have buried. My mind ran through memories, searching for clues I had missed. The suspense gnawed at me, and yet, underneath it, there was a strange thread of trust. She was holding something back, yes, but she was also preparing to share it. The difference this time was that I wasn't being shut out completely. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat in the chair by the window, watching the streetlight cast its dim circle on the road outside, and I made a decision. Whatever truth she carried, I wouldn't run from it. I wouldn't let it send me back into silence. For once in my life, I would wait without filling the gaps with anger or assumptions. Still, the waiting stretched me thin. Every letter that arrived, every phone call, I wondered if this would be the one where she told me. And each time it wasn't, I felt both relief and frustration twist together. When her envelope finally came, thicker than the others, I knew it was different before I even opened it. My breath caught as I slid the pages free. She had written, "There's something I've carried for years, and it's time you know." I didn't read further right away. I sat with those words in front of me, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down. The story I had been bracing myself for was about to unfold. and all I could do was hope I was strong enough to meet it with open hands instead of clenched fists. The letter in my hands felt heavier than the paper itself. For years, I had been waiting for her to trust me enough to say the words she had been holding back, and now here they were, waiting to be read. But before I let my eyes move across the page, I sat still, reminding myself of the promise I had made. Whatever truth she offered, I would meet it without turning away. Her writing was unsteady, as if each line had cost her more than she expected. She told me she had spent years believing she had failed me, not the other way around. After her mother passed, she said she had tried to hold the pieces of our family together on her own. But when I withdrew into silence, she convinced herself it was because she wasn't enough to keep me present. That guilt, she wrote, was something she carried into every part of her life. It wasn't until recently, until our letters, that she realized how much of it wasn't hers to bear. I read those lines 3 times before I could move on. The thought of her carrying that weight alone, punishing herself for my mistakes, tore through me in a way no argument ever had. She hadn't just been angry with me. She had been blaming herself for years because I had never told her the truth of my own absence. She went further. She wrote that sometimes she worried I wouldn't want to hear her confessions because they might shift my picture of her. She admitted to moments of resentment, of saying harsh things about me to others, things she now regretted. She said she wasn't proud of it, but she needed me to know the whole of it if we were ever going to move forward honestly. When I finished the final page, I set it down and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. It struck me then how different this ending was from the one I once imagined. I used to think there would be some clean reconciliation, a moment where all was forgiven in a single breath. But what she gave me was better, even if it was harder. It was truth without decoration, the kind that leaves no room for illusions. I wrote back slowly, over several days, letting each thought take its shape before I put it on paper. I told her I had never meant for her to carry my silence as blame, that the weight of my absence had been my own weakness, not her fault. I admitted to the shame I had felt, how it had kept me away, and how much I regretted letting it steal so many years. But I didn't ask her to erase the anger she had once spoken about me. I told her that if she had cursed my name or pushed me away in words, I understood. It was what I had earned, and it was proof that even when she was furious, she still felt something for me. Indifference would have been worse. When the letter was done, I sat with it a long time before sending it. I knew there was no way to script her response, no guarantee that this was the turning point I wanted it to be. All I could do was trust that honesty, late as it came, mattered more than silence. Her reply didn't come quickly. Weeks passed. Each day I checked the mailbox, my chest tightening with the same old doubts. Maybe I had said too much. Maybe I had ruined what little we had rebuilt. Maybe she had folded my words away and decided to leave them unanswered. But one morning, there it was. A plain envelope with her handwriting, slightly smudged at the edges. I carried it inside, sat at the table, and opened it with hands that shook more than I liked to admit. She didn't write much this time, just a few paragraphs. She said she had read my letter over and over, and every time it loosened something in her. She wrote that she didn't know what the future of our relationship would look like, but for the first time, she believed it had one. And she ended with a line I never thought I'd see. I don't want to keep you on the outside anymore. I set the letter down and let out a breath I felt I'd been holding for years. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't neat. But it was enough. More than enough. After that, the rhythm of our letters continued. Not with the urgency of desperation, but with the steadiness of two people finally willing to show their full selves. Sometimes the pages were filled with simple details about her days. Sometimes they circled back to the harder subjects, but they did so with a clarity that didn't frighten me anymore. The last time I saw her in person before this chapter of our story began, she wouldn't even look me in the eye. Now, though, I carried her words in my pocket, a reminder that what seemed broken beyond repair could still be mended. Not by pretending the cracks weren't there, but by choosing to live with them in the open. When I think back to the beginning, to that moment when her fiancé made his careless joke and I met it with an investigation, I almost laugh at the bluntness of it. I thought strength was about control, about showing I couldn't be dismissed. But strength, I learned, was sitting with the silence, waiting for her truth, and choosing not to walk away when it arrived heavier than expected. And that's where I'll leave it. Not with a grand finale, not with a perfect embrace, but with something real. Two people learning how to write again, not just on paper, but into each other's lives. When I look back on everything, I realize this wasn't just about standing up in one single moment. It was about proving to myself that dignity doesn't have an expiration date. Too often people assume age or circumstance makes us powerless. But the truth is, the years teach you how to recognize games others play, and how to choose a response that carries weight. Every setback was a reminder that silence can be mistaken for weakness, but a measured stand can echo for generations. I didn't do all of this for applause, and I didn't do it to hold grudges. I did it to show that self-respect is worth protecting, even when it comes at a cost. If nothing else, I hope my journey reminds you that protecting your place in this world, your seat at the table, isn't just about survival, it's about honor. And if you think this chapter closed with finality, let me just say life had a way of testing that resolve again. The very next challenge came from someone who thought they held the power over where I lived, only for me to turn the tables in a way they never saw coming. If you're ready to see how that unfolded, you'll want to keep watching.